การประชุมวิชาการประจำปีระดับชาตินะครับแน่นด้วยสาระและก็มีการผ่อนคลายอยู่เป็นระยะนะครับเราจัดงาน2วันนะครับวันนี้25และ26พฤศจิกายน2562ณโรงแรมสุโกศลนะครับห้องประชุมแห่งนี้ครับ
ค่ะโดยในช่วงเช้านะคะวันนี้เราจะมี plenary session เป็น2-3 ช่วงนะคะโดยที่2ช่วงแรกเนี่ยเราจะได้รับเกียรตินะคะแก่จากท่านวิทยากรภายใต้หัวข้อ Creative accreditation for better quality education และนโยบายการประกันคุณภาพการศึกษาด้านสุขภาพนะคะ accreditation policy for quality health professional education หลังจากนั้นเนี่ยเราจะมีการโต้วาทีกันนะคะ
ครับผมรับรองว่าสนุกมากครับเพราะว่าการโต้วาทีก็ได้ทั้งสาระและก็ความบันเทิงนะครับก็เป็นการโต้วาทีสำหรับบุคลากรด้านสุขภาพนะครับหารับชมที่ไหนไม่ได้ครับต้องมาฟังสดๆที่ห้องประชุมแห่งนี้สำหรับการโต้วาทีนะครับช่วงบ่ายก็จะมีการแบ่งห้องออกเป็น3เซสชั่นนะครับก็ห้ามพลาดเช่นเดียวกันนะครับสำหรับท่านใดที่อยากจะดาวน์โหลดเอกสารการประชุมนะครับที่บัตรด้านหลังนะครับจะมี QR code นะครับมีทั้งเรื่องของเอกสารการประชุมและที่สำคัญก็คือเรื่องของการประเมินความพึงพอใจว่าการจัดงานครั้งนี้สำเร็จมากน้อยแค่ไหนได้รับประโยชน์เพียงใดนะครับขอความกรุณาทุกท่านนะครับร่วมประเมินที่ QR code ด้านหลังนะครับ so right now we are ready to witness the keynote speech presentation okay our keynote speaker he is a former president of the Association of Medical Schools in Europe emeritus professor of medicine at the University of Manchester and hold various visiting professorships. He was Dean of the Medical Faculty in Manchester for 7 years and Chair of the Council and Head of Medical School in the UK. And importantly, he has been the President of the World Federation of Medical Education since January 2015. And today, he is going to share with us his keynote speech on creative accreditation for better quality education. Please warmly welcome Professor David Gordon.ศาสตราจารย์เดวิด กอร์ดอนครับเรียนเชิญครับ
Thank you very much, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, and indeed thank you for the invitation to be here. As I arrived this morning, I realized why it is that people from other parts of the world so much like to come to Thailand. And here I am. And I'm very pleased to be talking about accreditation as a creative process because I believe very strongly that it is. But I'm going to, as well as that positive thing, I'm going to say one or two negative things, not because I'm going to be negative generally, but because I think we need to look at the nature of evidence. So there we are. I believe that accreditation can be creative, but I think we need to look at the nature of evidence in education and to try and use it to make a positive way forward. And as with everything in education, it's very much determined by culture. A country like this with a long tradition in higher education is in a much better position than in many countries where the tradition is much more recent. So the content is very much culturally determined, and I hope you will forgive me if some of the humor is a little bit culturally determined as well. So I'm going to this is the outline of what I will talk about, a little bit about me, a little bit about the World Federation for Medical Education, what it is, how it happened, what it does. Then I'm going to talk about 3 milestones in the development of medical education. First of all, the Flexner report, which looked at medical education in the United States and Canada 110 years ago. I'm going to talk about the Lancet Commission, which I'll refer to as Frank and Chen, you'll see why, but the Lancet Commission on health professions education, because I know that's been very influential here, and it's a paper that we also thought about very considerably. And then I'll talk about accreditation, which I think is a milestone also in the development of medical education. As I mentioned, I'll talk about the nature of the evidence that we have in education. And as I said, I would introduce it with one brief word about me. And the personal background is that although I'm a doctor, a medical doctor, when I was the dean in Manchester, it was a faculty what was called MDNP, Medicine, Dentistry, Nursing and Pharmacy. So I'm used to some of the issues in some of the other professions. And indeed, we were very much concerned at the process of maintaining the quality of education in all those 4 subjects, and indeed later, psychology as well. So first of all, a word about the World Federation for Medical Education. Its duty, its aim, is to enhance the quality of medical education and to promote high standards in education. It's a partnership organization. There are 6 regional associations for medical education. The founding members, the organizations that set us up, were the World Health Organization and the World Medical Association. And we also have 3 additional elected members on the committee: the Junior Doctors Network of the World Medical Association, the International Federation of Medical Students Associations, and the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates of the United States. Now, as I say, we were founded by the World Medical Association and WHO, both of whom felt that there was the need for a worldwide organization concerned with the quality of education, and they felt that neither of them could do it on their own. And we work on many different areas, but the 3 biggest ones are the promotion of accreditation, where we have a program for recognition of accrediting agencies. We work on standards for basic medical education, postgraduate medical education, and continuing professional development. And jointly with our colleagues at FAMA in the United States, we run the World Directory of Medical Schools, which endeavors to list every medical school in the world. That's the World Federation Executive Council as it met in Seoul earlier this year. And you can see it's a very international body. If I just go along the back row, you can see members from Nigeria, the United States, Mexico, South Korea, the UK, that's me, the Czech Republic, Germany, and Singapore. So genuinely very much worldwide. The World Medical Association is represented by its Secretary General, who's there. The World Health Organization was not actually present on this occasion, they couldn't come. ECFMG is represented by the President of the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates, and a very important member is the member for the International Federation of Medical Students Associations. I emphasize the importance because they have an overview and they have a lot of common sense. And I can see one other person here who's been on the Executive Council of the World Federation, and you would agree that when you want something, a piece of sense talking, you turn to the medical student, and he or she will usually be very good. That was our student member until earlier this year. The regional associations cover the 6 regions of the world in which the World Health Organization also works, and they're shown there on the map and with their logos. And of course here we are in the Southeast Asia region, Southeast Asia Regional Association for Medical Education. These regional associations do a little bit come and go. From time to time they're very strong, and then without leadership then they may fall away and need a little bit of reviving. The Southeast Asia Regional Association has been extremely strong ever since the presidency was actually in Thailand. and it was passed on to India, and it's now the president is in Indonesia, but it's a very vigorous association. And as I say, those are the three main programs. This is from our website. Oops, let me go back. Accreditation, the recognition of accrediting agencies, standards for medical education, and the World Directory of Medical Schools. And those are the three main projects, but they do all interlink one with another. Now, in the summary that I prepared, a very brief one which is in the papers, I mentioned that from 1837 until 1910, there was a steady process to think of the improvement of medical education. Why did I choose those dates? Well, 1837 was the date when, the first date that we can record in modern times, when a regulatory process was put in place for medicine and medical education in one part of the world. And that was in Tasmania, just off the coast of Australia. And this is the Act of Parliament that set up the rules for medicine in Tasmania. It's a very long piece of paper. I haven't kept it all. But I've used the words most lawless because the colleagues who run the Australian Medical Council now point out that the reason why this had to be introduced so early was because medicine in Tasmania was in such a chaotic state. The next country that was the most lawless and had to have a medical council to regulate things was actually the UK. All the rest of the world was better behaved. 1910 was the Flexner Report, and there's Abraham Flexner as a relatively young man. He was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation to review education right across North America, in particular in the United States, but he went to medical schools in Canada as well. And he went and assiduously examined every medical school to see what it was like, to see what the premises were like, to look at the quality of the staff, to look at the quality of the students, and to consider the nature of the course. And this was an astonishingly effective report. His report was published in 1910 with a number of very clear-cut and very positive outcomes. He insisted that the standards must be very suitable and very high. You can't have substandard medical schools. The academic content of the course was important, the quality of the staff. The course needed to be long enough. It needed to have appropriate facilities, and so on and so on. And he suggested that poor quality schools could look to bring in best practice from abroad, at that time particularly from medical education in Germany. And the outcome was that after 1910, in a very few years, half of all the medical schools in the United States closed. The only ones that survived were the ones that were good enough. And that's a very remarkable effect, to actually go in somewhere and close half of all the medical schools. So there we are. There's Flexner as a rather older man, still looking very serious. He went on to do many other things after that time. He founded the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and so on. So a very positive and very effective report. But I will just point out two things that maybe were not ideal. One is in the nature of education. He was very clear that education must be scientific, and he used the example of the curriculum and the structure of the course at Johns Hopkins University Medical School in Baltimore. Now, by insisting that there was a very strong scientific component in the first half of the course, the first 2 years, meant that there was little possibility, for example, of developing an integrated curriculum at that time. If it's at all desirable to have an integrated curriculum, that's a good question. There was little opportunity for education outside the hospital, for example, in primary care or in clinics away from the main teaching hospital. And that was something that took a while to change. And by a scientific curriculum, he meant anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, and those sort of subjects. But if you look at the nature of medical practice, of course, students need to understand society. They need to understand the law as it relates to medical practice. I personally believe they need an understanding of anthropology and economics and so on. So that Flexner actually put the medical curriculum into a very pure scientific framework. And just as an example of the kind of thing which I think is extraordinarily valuable, but he wouldn't have seen, this AIDS and Accusation by Paul Farmer is a narrative about the AIDS epidemic as it developed in Haiti. And of course, the way in which the disease was understood and the way in which the population with the disease was treated was related not just to the virology and the transmission of the disease, but it was related to all sorts of other considerations about the belief about the individuals, about how society worked, and so on. And Professor Farmer is professor of both infectious disease and of anthropology at Harvard, so he's well qualified to put those together. So that would have been very difficult to imagine in the pure Flexner model. The other less positive outcome, and this may or may not be a very important thing, but it has been pointed out that at the time he wrote his report, there were 7 medical schools in the United States known as historic black medical schools. These were the 7 medical schools that would accept black students, African-American students. And Flexner explicitly commented that 5 of them were of poor quality, and those are his words: the Negro needs good schools rather than many schools. And so, as I say, 5 schools closed, and only Howard, which is in Washington, and Meharry in Nashville survived, and they are still there. But it did mean that after 1910, it became very difficult for a black student to get admission to medical school, more difficult than it had been. And that was led again to a weakness in the healthcare system, those parts where such doctors practiced. Just as a little historic anecdote, a paper about this describes the way in which some students either traveled to Europe or, even in those very early and quite prejudiced days, they would sometimes go to other universities, and University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, Yale, University of Michigan, even in the 19th century, accepted good quality students from ethnic minorities and saw them through the course. One other fact which I certainly didn't know until I was reading to gather the material for this talk is that the first black physician to take a full medical degree, Dr. Smith, studied at the University of Glasgow. So he had travelled all the way from the United States to Scotland, went through medical school there, and then went back home. And I don't think the University of Glasgow even knows that. I'm going to tell the dean next time I see her. So that's potentially a less positive outcome. There's Howard University, which, as you see, founded in 1867, and it's still there. I couldn't get a very good picture of the class there, but if you look closely, it is indeed still largely an ethnic minority class. And that's a picture of the Meharry School in Nashville. You won't be able to read the caption on it, which in rather old-fashioned terminology says it's the Meharry Medical School for Negroes, Nashville, Tennessee. And the kind of thing that was lost was this: the Leonard Medical School in Raleigh, North Carolina. That was the medical school building there, and this was the Associated Hospital. But it was just below the threshold to be deemed good enough, and it died about 8 years after the Flexner report. The buildings are still there. This is now a school, not of medicine, but of theology. You study religion there. So that was Flexner, and it was overwhelmingly positive, but not entirely so. The next one I want to talk about is the Lancet Commission, and this, you will remember the top of the paper as it appeared in the Lancet. Health Professionals for a New Century, Transforming Education to Strengthen Health Systems in an Interdependent World. And colloquially, we refer to it as being Frank and Chen because they were the lead authors. Julia Frank, who was at that time at the Harvard School of Public Health, and Lincoln Chen, who was at what had been the International Institute for Medical Education in New York, but had reverted to being the China Medical Board, whose logo is just down there. And they published this paper at the instigation of The Lancet, and it was launched simultaneously in the United States with Dr. Frank talking, and in Geneva with the editor of The Lancet talking, Richard Horton. And I was present in the audience when Horton was talking, and this is one of his slides, which is the number of medical schools per 10 million population. Now, if you've got the rather obsessional mind that I've got, you can work out from the outlines some of the countries. There's Kazakhstan, there's Germany, obviously that little diamond pointing out there is the Czech Republic, and so on. And as Richard Horton was talking, I did the calculation in my head, and the figures for those 4 countries were actually wrong. Not just slightly wrong, but definitely wrong. This is a table from a paper we published about it, and as we say in the caption, the figure shown for medical schools per 10 million population for each one of those 4 countries is wrong. How many other errors are there in that figure? And without the data that they use, it's difficult to actually check. But a paper like that has errors is a worry. It was a worry at the time when Dr. Horton was talking about it, because I was about to leap out of my chair and try to interrupt him, and I was held in place by John Norsini from Faber, who said, save it up. I did, at the break, say to him, you know, there are some factual errors there. We ought to write to you about it. So he said, no, don't write to us. Write to the authors, and then they can put in a correction. We wrote to the authors and pointed out some other errors, and the authors said, well, it doesn't really matter, the facts don't matter, we've got opinions, and our opinions we think are correct. We went into this into more detail, and we actually looked in detail at things like the appendix, which was on the internet, and we were told had been peer-reviewed, had been refereed. And it included the words, you know, when they'd gone through the figures, that we arrived at rough estimates of XXXXX dollars and YYYY dollars for the annual expenditures for medical and nursing education. So those really are rough figures. That was actually published and allegedly peer-reviewed. If you had a paper in therapeutics or in biochemistry where you'd put X's instead of the real figures, the editors would have turned it down. So we were quite concerned. And we felt that this was actually dishonest to publish a paper with errors in the data without getting it correct. As I mentioned, the IIME was an offshoot of the China Medical Board. The China Medical Board actually had nothing about this on its website. But there we are. There was Julio Frank introducing the report at the same time as Richard Horton was talking in Geneva. So that is a report with errors in it, and as I say, Hans Kahler and I wrote a paper about it, a review and a commentary on the Lancet Commission report, and it's there in World Medical and Health Policy if you want to consult it. We went in detail into the whole paper. And for example, they produced what they thought were their main conclusions, 10 instructional reform elements that they thought, things that should be changed. And of those 10, we said, actually, on the data that you're presenting, we don't agree. On 3 of them, we said, yes, that's very fair, but actually it's already been done. And then there were 3 which were good suggestions, which needed to be acted upon. And for example, their lead instructional reform element was to say that all curricula should move to be competence-based. And that's very reasonable position, but in their narrative about this, they had not looked, as far as we can see, at any of the published data and work that had been done on competence-based curricula. So it's been an influential paper. People still refer to it, and it's been used a lot, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But we did feel that the one cardinal conclusion that they had, that the failures in education were the cause of failure in healthcare, we thought that was wrong. And in our own paper, we produced a lot of examples of how education had actually led to positive changes in healthcare rather than negative. So let me move on to talk about accreditation. And as I say, this is a thing that's very active in our minds at the moment, but let's go back in history. And this is a picture of a Roman marketplace, so more than 2,000 years ago. And the narrative that we have was from a marketplace when Egypt was part of the Roman Empire. And we have documentary evidence of a young doctor, recently qualified, who wished to use space in the market to open his medical practice. And to get permission to do that, he was questioned by the manager of the market. Where was he educated? What was the curriculum? Who were his teachers? What was the evidence that he was competent as a doctor? In other words, the market manager was actually doing some quality control on education 2,000 and more years ago. We know about this because the young doctor was wrote a letter to his mother, which is a thing that young doctors should always do. So, in other words, the point I'm making is that for a very long time, we've had an ethos that you need to be sure that the doctor knows what he's doing. That narrative is due to my colleague, Professor Vivian Nutton. Now, the World Federation first published its standards for medical education in 2003. And following on from that, there was the idea that those standards could then be used as the basis for developing accreditation of medical education, for developing a process to evaluate how well it worked. And my predecessors at the World Federation set this in place, and we actually had documents recommending how accreditation should be done. But then, out of the blue, 9 years ago, at a meeting of the International Association of Medical Regulatory Agencies in Philadelphia, the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates said that from 2023, 4 years from now, they would not support a graduate from abroad to enter the United States medical licensing examination. The doctor would have to come from a school that was properly accredited. And by properly accredited, they said either in the North American system or by a formal process that uses other globally accepted criteria, such as those put forth by the World Federation for Medical Education. They didn't warn me this was coming. I was sitting in the audience at the time, fell off the chair, but then at the end of the announcement, I left very rapidly and emailed the office and said, we've got to change the website and we've got to put things in place. And there was a process developed as to how we would assess accrediting agencies. Now, the criteria, the level at which an accrediting agency should work and how we measured that, those were already agreed with the World Health Organization, a conference in 2005. But how should we create a process to do this? And a team set to work to do it. There's probably the three key members, Leif Christensen and Jørgen Niestrup from Denmark, and Marta van Zanten from the United States. And they worked and worked and worked and created the documentation and the entire process. And of course, we use a process to evaluate an accrediting agency, rather like the process that you use for the accreditation of a medical school. You ask the accrediting agency to evaluate and assess itself, look at how it actually is working, be self-critical. The documentation, what are its rules, what are its guidelines, and so on. We have a site visit to observe the agency at work, just as an accrediting agency will make a site visit to a medical school. And we also have a process of looking at the decision-making. How does the agency actually look at the report of its site visit, look at the report on the papers, and come to a final decision about the medical school? And it's important to do that because we've met a few instances where there's been an assiduous, careful site visit and a careful assessment, and then the final decision-making process has been very crude or perfunctory. Now, so that's the final decision-making process on whether the accrediting agent should be. Now, we started off by saying, should we accredit this accrediting agency? That's very confusing. Should it be accepted? No, we didn't use that. So the word we use is recognized. And for clarity in our own minds, this is not an official terminology, but for clarity in our own minds, we don't talk about accrediting accreditors as well as accrediting medical schools, and we don't talk about standards for medical education and standards for accreditation. We talk about medical schools being accredited, measured against standards for education, and accrediting agencies being recognized using criteria for recognition. And we do that just to keep it clear in our own minds. Even then, we sometimes use confusing words, but it's helpful to actually think about what you're actually talking about. And since that first announcement in 2010 and the first assessment done a couple of years later, we've been feeling our way to getting the process to work well. The team that set up the process took a lot of advice from colleagues in the United States, and so the processes at first felt very American, and we've moved to make them more global, more acceptable worldwide, because accreditation doesn't have to be done exactly the same as it's done in America. No, it's an immensely laborious process there, and that's unreasonable. The original plans were that there should be the final decision-making meeting just once a year, and that put in delays that were very difficult for schools coming up for accreditation, for agencies coming up to be recognized, so we've changed that. The committee that makes the final decision, that's an interesting question as well, because it used to be the presidents of the 6 regional associations for medical education, but we discovered that within that there were 1 or 2 potential conflicts of interest, and we spent a lot of time and effort with lawyers to work out a correct process. And we now have a new recognition committee which is entirely independent, 6 very distinguished people from all around the world who are meeting physically near Geneva in the next couple of months, but will generally speaking be working over the internet to come to final decisions. The papers originally as written were rather too long. They really went on and on and on. And there are 2 reasons for that. One is that my Danish colleagues who wrote them, Danes write very good English, but they write very long English. The other thing is that Americans, almost all Americans, do write at more length than is actually natural for us. Some Americans actually can't get beyond a tweet, but these papers were rather long. And so we also had to work out a lot of details. How do we recruit assessors to go and look at these things? How do you train them? How do you evaluate them? What's the travel policy? How do we organize the site visit? All of that kind of stuff, and all that has been worked through and worked through and worked through, and we now, I think, have it working really pretty well. But it's been quite tiring. This has actually mostly rested on the shoulders of just, at any one time, just a couple of people. And interestingly, the person who has the best and clearest thinking about this is the youngest person, which is, there's a moral there. How much does it cost? Well, about 7 years ago, we went into a systematic process to break down the real expenses and what would it be. And we ask agencies to pay $60,000 in total. And the principles were that it must, as far as possible, cover the true full cost. It must have a little surplus, and then that can be used in a process to help countries and accrediting agencies that are too poor to pay the full 60,000. And to make sure that we get the money, one principle is that we would get the payment before the final assessment, because otherwise people would just run away. And how far have we met those principles? Well, the first one, does it as far as possible cover the cost? Barely. Is the process for countries with very little money? Yes, that process is in there, and it's been used once or twice. Do we get payment before the final assessment? Well, not always, but mostly it works quite well. Interestingly, one country that has come through, which has a very small domestic economy, we were certain that they would need to be given the complete remission of the cost. The president of the medical council in that country thought it was important, so he went to see the Minister of Health. The Minister of Health said, well, this really is important, so he went to see the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister went to see the President of the country, and the President said, this is a matter of national prestige. I will pay for it myself. And he did. And that particular agency was assessed and did extremely well. One or two things that needed to be corrected. The president who paid the $60,000 is actually in prison now because he'd stolen the $60,000, but never mind. The agency is working well, and that particular country has good medical schools as a consequence. We have to develop a strategy for meeting any shortfall in costs, and indeed we are going to go through in the next 2 or 3 months a recosting exercise, and it is possible that the figure will come out at slightly more than 60,000. So what have we done recently in the recognition program? Well, as I say, it's a process is using a model like accrediting a medical school. It's medicine specific. There is the self-evaluation. We observe the site visit. We have a recognition committee that looks at the results. The criteria are based on the, as I mentioned before, on the WHO WFME meeting of 2005. And those criteria have been evolved using, taking an expert consensus. The last major update was last year. We made a few tiny changes this year. Nothing is, they're now going to be constant until 2023, so that everybody knows that it's moving steadily. And there's a site visiting team in Japan. One thing that we've been very pleased indeed to learn is that a number of agencies have said, this is really helpful. You're our partners in developing what we do. You're not just making sure that we're compliant. Of the agencies that have been assessed and been through the system, all but 2 had things that needed to be changed. In some cases, 3 or 4 small things. In some cases, 10 or 15. There are only 2 countries that went through without any difficulty at all. Nothing that needed to be changed. One of those is a highly developed country, not in Europe, but or North America. Incidentally, the Americans, we assessed the American agency, LCME, and we came up with things that they could improve. And they said, we had no idea, thank you very much. But the other country that went through without any difficulty is a distinctly third world country, a lot poorer than Thailand, much poorer, and yet they have in their country a system which is firmly making sure that the accreditation of medical schools is exactly right. It's led by an engineer, which I think may be a moral. And this is an example of a site visiting team where there was a lot of discussion and the agency felt that it was valuable. It's in Indonesia. The team, one is from Sri Lanka, one from Australia, and one from the Czech Republic. But the Indonesian agencies recognized there were a number of things that were suggested that could change, but it really worked well. And they thanked us for the advice that was given. At the moment, we have 20 accrediting agencies recognized in the order in which they came through. Thailand was number 12. There are another 3 where the site visit has been completed, but we haven't yet got to the final decision there. And very varied in size. One is Cyprus, with only 3 or 4 medical schools. One is the People's Republic of China. And we've been equally thorough with China as we were with Cyprus. And as I say, those come to a final decision fairly soon. There will be many more in 2020. There are a further 10 agencies close to the site visit, and there are 11 in the process, but at an earlier stage. So we're increasing quite rapidly. That is the number that have been completed in each year. One only in each of the first 2 years, but 11 in the current year, and it will be much more than that. So we're increasing very rapidly. We are asked questions. Have we turned anyone down? The answer is no, but we have a process where if things are going badly, we say to the agency, this is going badly. This is the preliminary report. What do you want to do? And we allow them to withdraw and come back in, learning the lessons of the first time round. We've done that twice. One of them is still to come back in, but the one that had to withdraw before, very, very poor performance in their first assessment. Their second assessment, perfect. So it was a valuable process, and it was. So we're not in the business to try and stop accreditation. We're in the business to try and make accreditation better. This is a favorite phrase, you know, surely you understand that medical education in my country is the best in the world and shouldn't need external assessment. And that would be discriminatory in the extreme. So highly developed countries like Australia have been treated exactly the same as much less developed countries like Egypt or the Sudan or whatever. Does the accrediting authority have to come in for recognition? No, it doesn't have to, but if your graduates want to go to the United States, they will need to. When will ECFMG clarify its policy for 2023? That's up to them, but we have an excellent dialogue with them, and I think the 2 things that I always feel able to say is, first of all, I'm absolutely certain that as 2023 is approaching, ECFMG will be completely and absolutely fair. The other, and the president of ECFMG has said this explicitly, whatever happens, medical students and recently qualified doctors must not suffer inappropriately. So I think it will be done in a very fair way. Those are the questions we're asked. The questions we should be asked, there are 2 or 3 like this. You know, who says you should do it? Well, ECFMG said we could do it, and so we started to do it. No one else does it. But we don't have any authority given to us by any body, but we have, if you like, an earned authority doing it, rather than positional authority being where we are. And we're up to developing trust in what we do, which I hope we've mostly got. Is it right for us to have a monopoly on doing this? That's a very good question. I don't have an answer. And what are we worried about? Well, there are a lot of things. But I think the biggest question we ask ourselves is to how to keep the process of recognition of accreditation fair, but not inappropriately rigid or even mindless. In 1 or 2 countries, the standards for medical schools don't have a lot about the curriculum or the staff, but they have, you know, your lecture theatre should measure this much. And we do say that standards for medical education should not involve the use of a tape measure. And are we cost effective? Is accreditation effective? Well, there is a literature. This is just one example of a paper that Marta van Zandt and Jacques Boulet wrote. But my favorite paper is one there, Al-Rebish and others, from Saudi Arabia and Australia. And I'll leave these slides so that you can pick up the exact reference. And they make the point that accreditation is not a matter of passing the examination. It's a much more long-term improvement process. And certainly having sat on the other side, when I was the dean in Manchester, we really welcomed the visit of the General Medical Council because by the time they came to see us, we were a lot better than we had been a few months earlier. The other thing to say is that history cannot be ignored. I mean, if you like, the Flexner report was a kind of accreditation trawl through the whole of North America, and that closed half the medical schools. When the General Medical Council was established in the UK, again, about half of all the medical schools in England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales closed. So that's history. And we shouldn't really be all the time criticizing ourselves for lack of evidence in education, because there's a lack of evidence for most things in medical education. Education isn't a hard science, it's a social science. It's developed and adapted by society, so of course it will change and be culturally determined. We shouldn't expect the evidence for anything in education to be as definite as a piece of physiology or molecular biology. And so whenever someone says to you, this is the way to develop a curriculum, this is the right way to teach, this is the right way to do it, look at that very carefully and with caution. You know, if they're selling a new idea in education, you should be looking at them with the same care as someone who's trying to sell you a new drug. There are some crazy ideas in education, and this is one of my favorite ones, a quotation from a civil servant in a Ministry of Health, who said, the most important task of the new Director General of the World Health Organization is to create a common curriculum to be used in every medical school in the world so that all graduates can go and work in America without having to take the examination to go and work in America. He was wrong in at least 3 ways. The Director General of the World Health Organization does have more important things to do. There's no way in which the curriculum should be the same in every medical school because the needs in different countries are different. And no one's going to accept the idea that because your curriculum is a common one that you can just not go without taking any evidence. We look at clinical medicine and say, well, let's have clear-cut evidence for everything we do there. But even in clinical practice, as well as in education, we can sometimes get things wrong. I'll tell you a terrible story. This is the eye of a patient with AIDS and with herpes simplex. And that's the late stage, of course. When the ocular preparation of guanciclovir was made, the manufacturers used it on herpetic ophthalmitis, and it was cured. The Food and Drugs Administration in the United States didn't accept the records of the first 2 or 3 or 5 patients, so they demanded a double-blind clinical trial. And a group of men with AIDS and with herpetic ophthalmitis were divided into a treatment group and a placebo group. The placebo group all went blind. Was that clinical trial really worth doing? So, to end on an uplifting note, I could say a quotation like this, you don't stop pursuing dreams because you grow old because you stop looking at your dreams. And that was Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But rather than that, I thought I'd end with something completely unsuitable. I did establish earlier today that in the understanding of the English language in Thailand, you know what bullshit is. That's when someone is talking just rubbish. And I was delighted to be sent pictures just a couple of days ago of this machine. Those are 2 stills devised by Filipe Pinto Soares in Lisbon, in Portugal. He's an artist, and of course it's not a real machine. And there it is, and if I'm able to touch, let's see if I can get it to move. Yes, the meter rotates, so it can listen to see if anyone is talking bullshit, and then the mirror will reflect it onto your finger and you say, that's wrong. And I implore you, when you're looking at evidence in medical education, have a device like this to check it for you. Thank you very much.
So Thank you very much, Professor David Gordon, President of the Federation for Medical Education from Manchester, United Kingdom. So thank you for showing us your efforts for quality improvement and evidence-based practice and education to protect the public from badly educated medical professionals. So right now, may I invite our President เรียนเชิญท่านศาสตราจารย์นายแพทย์วิจารณ์พาณิชย์มอบของที่ระลึกแด่ท่านวิทยากรครับ Keynote Speaker ครับ Professor วิจารณ์พาณิชย์ will deliver the souvenir from our annual meeting to our keynote speaker, Professor David Gordon, the President of the Federation of Medical Education. So thank you very much. And we are looking forward to hearing you again next year, Professor Gordon. So thank you very much for joining us.